he made comments essentially saying that Europe needs to build its own strategic autonomy. And with the question of Taiwan, the breakaway state from China, which China considers to be a breakaway state and hasn't ruled out using force to take back, he said that the European Union shouldn't be the follower of America, that it should make its own policy and decide on its own strategic priorities regarding Taiwan. Now, this has caused widespread condemnation, specifically in America, on the other side of the Atlantic. A number of Republican senators coming out and saying, well, if Europe wants to leave us alone on Taiwan, we should leave Europe alone to deal with Ukraine themselves. That's what the Florida Senator Marco Rubio said. Another senator that's in charge of the political body within the Senate looking at the relations with the Chinese Communist Party called his comments a disgrace. Here in Europe as well, there's been some tentative concern because what the Americans have said is, does Emmanuel Macron speak for Europe, for the whole of the European Union? And there are a lot of people that feel strongly that Europe should stand side by side with America on the issue of Taiwan.
Now, do you think Macron is going to address his comments in the speech in The Hague today?
I think there will be huge pressure on him to do so. These comments have caused a real concern in the sort of overarching geopolitical structure, the delicate sort of network that we have at the moment, specifically hearing those American politicians and lawmakers talk about their support for Ukraine, because that's significant. Admittedly, they are from the opposition party, the Republican Party mainly. Lots of people will be looking to Emmanuel Macron to sort of clarify exactly what he means on this. But I think what he will do, I mean, I haven't seen the speech yet, but I think he will continue to insist that Europe does need to stand on its own 2 feet. This is, while these comments have caused a bit of a ripple right now, or perhaps even a wave some people would describe it, this is part of his long-standing political outlook on the European Union. He said during these comments as well, he reasserted his position that Europe needs to see itself and to build itself to being the third superpower up against China and the United States. That is his political philosophy. We'll have to wait and see how strongly he defends those comments, if he does, during this Future of Europe lecture that he's giving at a university in the Netherlands. But I think there's broad expectation that he will clarify some of the comments that he's made.
Jack, as you were just speaking there, we were seeing images actually of the Institute in The Hague where Macron is due to speak, and he's meant to be speaking. It was scheduled for about a minute ago. He's running a little bit behind schedule, but of course in political spheres we all know that that can happen quite often. Now, you were touching on some of Macron's policies and his ideas in general. What about where you are in Brussels? Are these shared with other leaders? Does Macron have many people who agree with him with regards to how he sees the future of Europe?
I think there is a broad sense that Europe should be creating its own policies specifically on this, but there's a long-standing transatlantic relationship between the European Union and the United States. Now, during the Trump presidency, that was kind of rocked, right? There were questions about exactly how much the European Union backed Donald Trump, specifically when, if you remember, when he moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv into Jerusalem in favor of the Israelis. There were a lot of things that the European Union started to question whether they were on the same page with the Americans on all of these issues. And I think what we're seeing, but while Macron has publicly come out and made these comments, there might be a sense in other European capitals that they'd like to be stronger on these things. But because trade, defensively, there's a lot of reliance on the Americans on the European continent. I think a lot of leaders won't come out so strongly. We heard actually the Polish Prime Minister, Mateusz Morawiecki, come out and say that Poland is fully backing the Americans. He sent a tweet out today saying they're fully the closest ally to Poland. They are concerned because these kind of comments can result in a sense in America that Europe doesn't really want them involved, and that can be really concerning for certain European countries, firstly from a defensive and security point of view, but also from an economic side.
Jack, We're just waiting for Macron to appear, but if you're just joining DW News, I'm speaking to my colleague, Brussels correspondent Jack Parrock, about Emmanuel Macron's state visit to the Netherlands, where he's expected to comment on a controversy over remarks made about Taiwan. It's the first state visit by a French president in more than 20 years, and as we're waiting for him to appear, Jack, tell us about this, the significance of this trip for Emmanuel Macron to the Netherlands. It's been over 2 decades since a French president has actually travelled to the Netherlands. Is it getting a lot more coverage, we'll say, than they had expected before the trip?
I think that's fair to say, Pablo, that perhaps we wouldn't be paying so much attention to this trip had he not have made those comments on Taiwan. I think this is an interesting moment. You know, a lot of these state trips between European allies and European Union members are often sort of unremarkable, unless it's perhaps the sort of big Franco-German summits when they get together, the big economic powerhouses. But that isn't to say that the Netherlands isn't an important ally for Emmanuel Macron. For a long time, it was considered this sort of, you know, what they called the liberal boy band of Europe, which was the French, the Belgian, the Luxembourgish and the Dutch, where they also had liberal prime ministers that would get together and club together sort of young men that would dress well. And Mark Rutte is sort of a really important part of that. And he's really important as a bit of a stick in the mud on European Union economic issues. And I think that's what Emmanuel Macron will be wanting to talk to him about. Macron is really in favour of harmonising the financial systems of the EU, making much more progress on things like the banking union, which is a plan to harmonise the banking systems across the European Union. The Dutch are much more hawkish on this. So Mark Rutte might be someone that he wants to persuade round. I think the reason that there aren't so many visits between these two countries, or state visits, is because they meet so often here in Brussels for European Council summits every couple of months or so, that they don't really need too much time to speak to one another one-on-one. They have a lot of that time, and that Mark Rutte and Macron would be broadly considered politically aligned, pro-EU stance, wanting a greater Europe, but differing, as I said, on these economic issues. I think that's probably what they'll be wanting to do. As we see, Macron is on a real tour of the world at the moment, trying to get his face, his comments into many of the major capitals of the world.
We'll be back to you shortly, Jack Parrock, at our bureau there in Brussels, DW correspondent Jack Parrock. We are just waiting for the French President, Emmanuel Macron, who is on a state visit to the Netherlands. He is due to speak at the Dutch Nexus Institute in The Hague, and it's expected that there's a lot of expectation to see if he will speak about this controversy over remarks made about Taiwan. But for now, thanks, Jack. Moving on, let's take a look now at some of the other stories making headlines around the world. Tens of thousands of junior doctors have gone on strike across England over poor pay and working conditions. The 4-day walkout is the most serious action in a series of strikes by staff of the National Health Service as workers struggle with a cost of living crisis. One of Russia's most active volcanoes has erupted in the far east of the country. The Sheveluch volcano spewed out an ash cloud over an area of more than 100,000 square kilometres, with authorities warning of potential effects on air travel. Officials have advised locals to stay home. Residents of Louisville in the U.S. state of Kentucky have been holding vigils to mourn the victims of a mass shooting. Authorities say a man armed with a rifle opened fire on Monday at the bank where he worked. He killed 5 people and wounded 9 others while live streaming the attack before shooting and killing himself. Well, staying in the US, where the Biden administration is reeling from the fallout of the most significant leak of government secrets since WikiLeaks in 2010. As the search for the source of the leak continues, Washington is busy doing damage control. The revelation suggests the US spied on key allies, including Israel and South Korea. On Tuesday, Seoul dismissed a significant number of the files as fake. The Pentagon says it's ordered an internal review describing the leak as a very serious national security risk. So what more do we know about the source and the origins of this leak? We put that question to DW security correspondent Thomas Sparrow.
Well, this is actually one of the most interesting and also one of the most difficult aspects of this, because it was revealed, it has been described that the original leak was actually published in a platform which is popularly used by gamers, even in channels that originally had nothing to do with these kinds of leaks that had to do with the game Minecraft. So this will pose an additional challenge to authorities that are clearly interested in preventing these kinds of documents from leaking. At the same time, however, and I think this is an additional element that is particularly important in this case, some of these leaks are being described as doctored or altered. Some are indeed being described as being authentic, but in other cases, they are being described as possibly being altered. So it is unclear at this point. It hasn't been verified independently at this point where these leaks actually came from and to what extent all of them are authentic. And this just poses another challenge to US authorities as they try to limit the damage from these leaks.
DW security correspondent Thomas Sparrow there. Well, officials in Ukraine are worried that those leaks could complicate efforts to defeat the Russian invasion. A source close to the Ukrainian president has told the media the leaks have prompted Kyiv to alter some of its military plans. This, as US intelligence suggests, dwindling Ukrainian ammunition stocks could see the battle in the east of the country heading towards stalemate for the rest of the year. Russian forces continue to pound Ukrainian positions around the besieged city of Bakhmut.
This footage purportedly shows parts of Bakhmut under Russian control. Vast areas of the city are in ruins. Just a few kilometers from the front lines in Chasiv Yar, these civilians are collecting aid supplies.
The only inconvenience is that there's no running water. Without electricity, you can get by somehow, but without water and washing detergent? I asked them and they gave me a bottle. I like to bring it over to the farm so that we can wash our clothes and ourselves.
The civilians left here are grateful for every bit of help they can get. The aid is brought in by drivers like Maxim, who often risk their lives.
Some time ago it was scarier, but now we've gotten used to it. You don't pay attention. Anything can happen, as they say. There's one projectile for everybody. Whatever can happen will happen, guys.
This man fled the fighting in Bakhmut 2 weeks ago on his bicycle. He says the destruction here in Chasiv Yar is just as bad as in Bakhmut. Only 1 in 10 buildings is still intact.
Why is this happening to us people who do not have anything to do with this? I just turned 60 and everything that I've made with my own hands I had to leave behind. I couldn't even take my USB stick with me because I couldn't get into my home.
While military vehicles head to the front lines, a few civilians cling on. Many of those still here do not have enough money to go elsewhere.
Now, imagine having settled in a new country only to find out years later that you're being kicked out. That's the case for about 200,000 Zimbabweans in South Africa. They were granted residency back in 2009. Human rights groups have taken the government to court, but the clock is ticking. The residence permits expire at the end of June. DW's Christine Mundwa met a teacher in Johannesburg whose family heavily depends on today's court ruling.
Far from his home in Zimbabwe, Ben Matsanure is contemplating the future. His life in South Africa might soon be coming to an end. He's been earning a living in Johannesburg, teaching and waiting tables.
A typical day for me, go to work, to go to school in the morning, and then later go to the restaurant. Because at the school I'm not earning much, so have to run around and make some more earnings. The family is reliant on my earnings this side. 2 children and the wife and other relatives. They look forward to what I send to them.
Matsanure can live and work legally in South Africa because he has a Zimbabwean exemption permit. These permits were offered to Zimbabweans who had been living in South Africa undocumented, and those who were seeking asylum after Zimbabwe's violent election in 2008. Now, after 12 years, the South African government is cancelling the permits, and permit holders have been told to apply for work visas, but these will only be given to applicants with critical skills. Like the majority of permit holders, Matsanure's work is not considered to be critical. Over the border in Bulawayo, his wife and 2 daughters worry about him having to return to Zimbabwe.
It stresses me a lot because I just don't know. I don't know how we'll make ends meet having him decide. Okay, with what I'm earning, I cannot sustain the family. I want to afford to pay for for our children's fees and their needs.
That coming back to them is really a life-changing thing. It means that I'll have to drop out of college. I've already started college and I'm about to finish. So if he comes back to them, that means I have to drop out of college.
Living standards in Zimbabwe have been in decline since the early 2000s. Today, about half of the population is reported to be living in poverty. Zimbabweans have migrated to neighboring countries in big numbers. Many have come to South Africa. And there's a growing anti-immigrant sentiment in South Africa that has at times escalated to violent attacks on foreign nationals. Some have suggested that the government is pandering to this populism in taking the decision to end the Zimbabwe exemption permits. But the authorities have maintained that these permits were always a temporary arrangement and never a pathway to citizenship or permanent residence. Rights groups have asked a court to stop the government from cancelling the permits.
There was no public consultation with the stakeholders prior to the decision being made to terminate the permits. If you have enabled people to found families, found lives here and careers, that you give them that fair opportunity to make representations so that you understand the circumstances of their lives and what they face when you make the decision to terminate. And that is absent in terms of the decision that has been made by the South African government here.
Ben Matsanure hopes the court will rule in favour of the appeal. He doesn't want to go back to Zimbabwe.
So how do I just suddenly stop here and go back there and start again? I'm finding it very difficult. I'd rather go somewhere else.
If the court rejects the appeal, Ben Matsanure and other Zimbabwean exemption permit holders have until the end of June to leave South Africa.
Now, DW's Thuso Khumalo is reporting from the court in Pretoria. He explains why the government don't want Zimbabweans in South Africa anymore.
There are quite a number of issues at play here. I think the first issue is economical. South Africa is facing high unemployment rate, and it is the feeling amongst a lot of South Africans here, including one group that was protesting here. They are just marching around. They've just left the court here, saying these Zimbabweans should go home because if they go, they are creating spaces for them to work. They are saying they don't get work because of these Zimbabweans. So these are sentiments that we've heard from our South Africans, but also it's also on the political front, because there's always been an argument that Zimbabweans that have run out of their country should stay in their country and fix their problems there. But according to the Home Affairs Department, the official statement, official position is that these permits were temporal. These were temporal permits done. You remember that in 2008, when there was political turmoil in Zimbabwe, they flocked into South Africa, so they had to accommodate them. Then they are saying the situation now is better. They should be going back. They can't remain in South Africa temporal. So these were not permanent permits. So the Home Affairs Department saying they are now cancelling them, and anyone who wants to come in should find another channel of applying for other permits that the country is offering. Now we are going to return to a story that we were following for you earlier. We're waiting
for a speech from the French President, Emmanuel Macron, who is on a state visit, a two-day state visit to the Netherlands. There is furor back home after comments that he made over Taiwan. And we're going to cross over now to my colleague in Brussels, Jack Parrock, who has been following this story very closely. And for our viewers who are just tuning in to us, we're going to just recap a little bit over this controversy which Macron is dealing with at the moment. So, Jack, this trip to the Netherlands, it comes, as I mentioned there, also hot on the heels of a big state visit to China last week. Now, while on that trip, Emmanuel Macron made some comments, as I said, about Europe's position in regard to Taiwan. Jack, can you bring us all up to speed about what he said exactly and what the reaction has been?
Yeah, hi, Pablo. We're still waiting for that Macron speech to start. Politicians often run a little bit late. As you say, Emmanuel Macron is off the back of a trip to Beijing and more broadly in the rest of China as well. And on the flight between two provinces, he told some French media in Politico, essentially, that he felt that Europe should not be the followers of America when it comes to discussions around Taiwan. Taiwan is claims its independence. China doesn't rule out taking it back by force. And there's a real delicate position at the moment where the Americans seem to be supporting Taiwan. There was a visit by the president of Taiwan to California, which the Chinese were very unhappy about. And as I say, President Macron briefed these reporters saying essentially that Europe should make its own policy. It should be considered its own superpower. It should be the world's third superpower and shouldn't follow either the Americans or the Chinese on this issue, but should make its own decision. Now, the Americans and a lot of Republican senators especially have come out and said, hang on, if Europe doesn't follow us and sort of back us on these issues, maybe we shouldn't back Europe on Ukraine. That was the comment by the Florida senator, anyway, Marco Rubio. And it's brought up a massive question here in Europe all over the weekend and running into today as we wait for this speech by Emmanuel Macron. The question is, who speaks for Europe? Does the French president go, when he makes comments like this, does he speak on behalf of all the European countries? We already know that that probably isn't the case. Specifically, we've seen the Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki tweet out saying, we are strong allies with the United States. And it was clear, while not specifically mentioning the Taiwan issues, he was making a point that from the Polish perspective, the perspective of the Polish government, that they back the Americans and want to stay on site. Countries in the east of Europe are very, very heavily reliant on the American presence that they fear, over the borders with Russia, because they're closest to Russia. They really feel that they need that American military and defense presence.
Now, Jack, as you were talking there, we're just seeing live images from the Dutch Nexus Institute in The Hague, where Emmanuel Macron is due to make a speech in English on European sovereignty, insecurity and economic matters. Now, Jack, you just mentioned some of the criticism there, but has anyone actually backed him or agreed with him, particularly here in Europe?
Yeah, not too much public support for him right now. But that isn't to say there isn't support for him. There is a sort of tacit understanding. If you speak to a lot of the diplomats here in Brussels, there is a sense, and that this really started to be much clearer during the Trump presidency, that there was a lot of people saying that Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet and not sort of jump to whatever the Americans were saying. Joe Biden, as a president, has been more favourable, without question, for European tastes. And the question is whether that should mean that still that sort of idea that the French president was putting forward, this sort of buzz phrase that gets bandied around a lot here in Brussels of strategic autonomy, trying to make Europe able to deal with its own issues, able to confront its own concerns. That is something that is popular among a lot of EU capitals, that they don't want to be reliant on the Chinese for the rare minerals, for energy from the Russians, for goods and sort of political guidance from the United States and defense as well. There is a sense that Europe would like to do that. A lot of European capitals would. But how they would do it, that's the other question. And I think there's a lot of discomfort that Emmanuel Macron will make such broad sweeping statements that tend to be then considered a sort of statement for Europe, at least in the eyes of the allied partners. That's where the discomfort comes from, that perhaps the Americans, the Chinese, because he's such a powerful leader in Europe, that they start to think that he's speaking on behalf of the whole of the European Union.
Now, as we've mentioned, Jack, and you've been touching on it there, the speech is billed as Macron's thoughts on the future of Europe. Now, previously he called for Europe to become the third superpower after the US and China. You're in Brussels and you're on the ground there and you speak to a lot of politicians, you're following the news closely there. What do people make of that kind of talk in Brussels?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. This idea of the future of Europe is one that's been going on for a while. We had a broadly ignored conference on the future of Europe to decide whether the European Union would entirely overhaul its systems of governance and whether there would be, much more integration on certain issues. Macron was a huge supporter of that. It was mainly done in Strasbourg at the second seat of the European Parliament. But the questions that perhaps he wasn't so comfortable about perhaps ending the two seats of that European Parliament, the French are certainly not in favour of, the other seat being here in Brussels. But we do know broadly what Emmanuel Macron is in favour of, and really what he wants is much deeper economic and financial and fiscal joining of the EU member states. He really is pressing for the banking union to be created much, or to at least be forwarded much more. He wants a much more unified system. He's even spoken in the past about the idea of a sort of EU finance minister rather than just having the Eurozone. He sees that as a big way to support the economic growth of the European Union, the economic integration that would then create it as that sort of third power that he talks about. A lot of other EU leaders would already say that the European Union is the third power. I think if you look at the institutional heads like Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission, she would talk about the European Union probably in those terms, not specifically those terms, but in the sense of Europe having that kind of power in its economic weight already. We'll have to wait and see. I think because he's had such a backlash for these Taiwan comments, it'll be really interesting to see what he says in this speech about the future of Europe and how strongly he will come out and defend. And it looks like he may soon start to be.
It looks like, Jack, I'm going to jump in there.
In the Netherlands.
It looks like he's about to speak now. We were just hearing there, well, we weren't hearing, we were seeing Rob Riemann, the founder of the Dutch Nexus Institute in The Hague. So, Jack, thank you so much for your analysis. We'll be back to you afterwards, I'm sure. Let's go to The Hague and listen to the French President, Emmanuel Macron.
Members of Parliament, Monsieur le Président, dear Rob, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I have to say that I do admire Nexus Institute, what you do and how much you delivered such strong messages, not just for Europe, but for humanity and our common values. Hello.
I think we lost something. Where is French democracy? Where did we lose it?
I can answer this question if you give me some time.
Nobody listens. You have millions of people in the streets. Conventions of climate has been put aside. What can you say when we talk about Europe?
Do you allow me to answer? But you want me.
If you're just tuning into DW News, we're just seeing Live images from
places
The Hague where
you can
Emmanuel
have
Macron is
violence.
speaking, and there's just
This is
been a
exactly
protest
places
there
where
taking place.
This
Let's
type of
listen back in.
expressions are forbidden. And this is why I do believe it's very important to have social debate. I don't know, and I can answer all the questions you have on what we are discussing in France, the law we are passing, and how this is a democracy. And a democracy is exactly a place where you can demonstrate, you can have, as in your country, this type of interventions. But as in the world, we are places where democracy doesn't exist. We should not compare precisely the two situations. We can disagree, but what should accompany democracy? Because you vote and you elect people. And people elected vote for laws and they have to respect constitutions. And these constitutions were voted by people. But the counterpart is that you need respect, and this is the end of violence. The day you consider that when I disagree with the law which is passed or the people who are elected, I can do whatever I want because I am the one to decide for the legitimacy of what I do, you put democracy at risk. From Capitol Hill to Brasilia to other types of happening, I would say. This is the main difference I do between a dictator, an autocracy, and a democracy. This is just a remark I wanted to make. And obviously I can revert in the questions on everything was mentioned, from climate to the pension reform in France and so on. But I wanted to take, indeed, the opportunity of the speech and what you offered to me, and to discuss about our Europe, and much more to discuss about our European sovereignty. And I think this concept is extremely important, especially in this time, because a little bit more than 1 year ago, Russia unleashed a barbaric war against Ukraine and opened probably one of the most perilous times of our European Union. Our Union is said to grow stronger through crisis, but never had we faced such a threat. A war involving nuclear power at our borders, and an unthinkable event that jeopardized lasting peace and brought violent conflict back to the European continent. Since our European summit in Versailles, a few weeks after the beginning of the war, during the French presidency, it was in March last year, Europe stepped forward and responded swiftly and efficiently, and has continued to do since. And both pandemic and war were a big accelerator of this European sovereignty. And this is what I wanted to advocate, and I wanted perhaps to elaborate a little bit on this concept and what it means today and what it should mean in the very context we know. European sovereignty could seem as a strange word. For years, this concept may have sounded like a French fantasy, or perhaps like European wishful thinking. I have to say, when I delivered a speech in La Sorbonne, September 17, a lot of comments were about, okay, European sovereignty, this is a French idea, this is just a speech. It will never happen. But I've decided to make these words central to my political projects, and I've never forgotten that the very concept of sovereignty has as well its roots in the Netherlands. And this is a very European concept. 350 years ago, right here in the city of The Hague, one of the founders of political modernity, Baruch Spinoza, wrote in an article 17, chapter 2 of his Tractatus Politicus, I quote him, "The right is defined by the power of the multitude. We call it sovereignty." I will not lecture you on Spinoza, I want to reassure you. I just want to highlight that in Spinoza's philosophy, sovereignty is a means to guarantee the essence of being, to persevere in oneself. To put it plainly, whoever wants to be themselves must be sovereign. In other words, and I want to insist on that, identity and sovereignty are intertwined. And I think this is very important to understand this link and the fact that Spinoza makes it as one of the founding concepts of precisely political philosophy. Because if you accept to lose your sovereignty, it means if you accept to depend on other powers, you put yourself in a situation not to decide for yourself and not to be in charge of precisely continuing, preserving, developing your own identity. See, defending sovereignty doesn't mean to shy away from our allies. It means that we must be able to choose our partners and shape our own destiny, rather than being, I would say, a mere witness of the dramatic evolution of this world. This means that we must strive to be rule makers rather than rule takers. And this we can do in a cooperative manner, in keeping with our spirit of openness and partnership. But I think the wake-up call was made during the pandemic. We discovered that we were dependent on a lot of devices, on a lot of drugs, on a lot of products, suddenly. And even those who were supposed to cooperate with us, some allies, decided to ban the export during months, as long as they were not served and protected. And during the war, those who decided to cooperate, to make trade with neighbors, even if they were not allies, Russia, for energy. Because we decided, de facto, that trade could be the best way to cooperate, could create irreversible links and precisely avoid the others to be aggressive. They decided to weaponize the energy, putting us in a completely crazy and unbelievable situation. Pandemic and war just pushed us in a situation to discover that we have to reduce our dependencies if you want to preserve the European identity. Otherwise, we will progressively be dependent on everything. And it's probably due to the fact, this is a sort of convergence with what I heard, Europe was, and especially the European Union, was too much driven by a customer approach and not sufficiently by the citizen and the producer approach. And we didn't build sufficiently how to ensure our, I would say, economic security. And my intention, what I want to advocate, is not to, in a certain way, revert to protectionism and so on. It doesn't make sense. But to try to design with you and to define, in a few minutes, what could be this comprehensive economic security doctrine for the European Union to guide our European action globally. And I mean to protect ourselves, our identity, and to put ourselves in a situation to define our current and our future model for ourselves. And for me, this new doctrine should be based on 5 pillars. The first one is very well known, but I want to insist on that. This is, I would say, the native one of our European Union. This is competitiveness and a stronger and a better European integration. This is the first pillar, and this is very important because you cannot be a strong role model, you cannot promote your identity, you cannot defend on the long run the European model if you are not competitive and you don't put yourself in a situation to be the one to produce the best-in-class solutions. This is why competitiveness is requested, and this is why you have to pass reforms, referring to what happened at the beginning of our discussions. Indeed, for instance, just an anecdote to illustrate. You cannot live in a continent if you decide not to be competitive at a country basis and you just leave competitiveness to the others. You kill your economy, but you put the whole continent in a situation not to be competitive and in a certain way not to produce any more in your place. How to produce aircrafts, cars, but even software or anything else if you are not competitive? The customers you are will refuse to buy at such a high price. Purchasing power is a debate everywhere. You want to buy it at a fair price. If you want to buy it at a fair price and produce it in Europe, you have to be competitive to do so. i.e., passing the reforms, being sure that you innovate, you have good labor laws, protecting your people and their rights, but creating sufficient flexibility to be competitive in an open world. This balance has to be found. France was no more balanced. I have to be very honest, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. We decreased by more than 2 points our unemployment rate thanks to the reform we passed. And we are passing a reform for pension. I'm not sure everybody is completely aware of that, but because today, this reform is quite complex, but we have special regimes for some categories which is not justified, so we have to stop with that. Because we are indebted and we have current deficits largely beyond your current deficit in Netherlands, and I'm not sure that the taxpayer in Netherlands will accept that we will finance a long-run social model in France with European taxpayer money, so I have to do the job at home. And I will pass from 62 to 64. When I compare, they should be less angry with me. Because in your country it's much higher, and in a lot of countries in Europe it's much higher than 64 years old. So matter of fact, but competitiveness and reforms being with this notion are absolutely essential if we want to stay as a continent of producer, and if we want to have the ability to decide for ourselves, i.e. to produce for ourselves. At the same time, we have now to insist on simplification and streamlining our regulation, which is absolutely key for this agenda. And we have to do much more on education, higher education and training. Because what is key for production is a very innovative word, is to have talents, skills, and to be sure that you train your people, being your native citizens or people coming from migration, to have the right skills for this current environment. And this policy is absolutely critical if you want to be sovereign and if you want to have this comprehensive economic security doctrine. But at the same time of this reform and competitiveness agenda, you need more Europe and more integration. We have to go further and much further. We have to integrate our market. Why? Because this is the best way to have strong players. When you create a startup in one of our countries, we have to deal with 27 regulations in a lot of sectors. When you do it in China or in the US, because this is where the competition is at stake, your domestic market is much bigger. The strength of Europe is our single market, and it's how to better integrate the single market on digital, on industry, and so on. And how, as well, to make it in common through discussions, sometimes controversies, and this unique myotic of our regulation in Europe, but building a common approach. It's even more essential on the financing of our economy, and I want to insist on that. The financing of our economy is and will be more and more critical in an innovative world, because you need talents and capital. And today, we are not properly equipped. We have a very good European regulation. We did a lot post-financial crisis, but we are still very fragmented, and we don't have a proper capital market union. And we need it. Why? Because you have a lot of savings in a lot of rich countries, but these savings are not properly allocated. They have to go to very innovative SMEs and to poor or middle-income countries in our Europe. If you want the savings to be allocated on the right risk and the right places where you have opportunities and returns, you need a capital market unions to be integrated. This is not the case today. Our savings are in very rich places, but they don't circulate and they are not properly allocated, which is, for our competitiveness and our futures, I think, a weakness. So here's the first pillar of our economic doctrine, competitiveness and better European integration. This is a necessity in this economy and this environment where we are at stake. The second pillar is having industrial policies. A a very long time, it was a taboo in Europe. Because the first pillar was sufficient. During decades, the first pillar I mentioned was the alpha and omega of our economic policies. Having industrial policy was forbidden because it was an intervention on the market to decide something, to interfere, to create bias and so on. But we need it. Why? Because our competitors today are interfering in the market, matter of fact. And because we have to accelerate, and because we put ourselves in a situation to be too much dependent because of the unbalance between market and public intervention in Europe. Let me express by taking one example. If you don't have industrial policy, you cannot create progressively your autonomy, or at least your de-risking on energy. This is impossible. If you don't have a political an interference, I would say, or an intervention of industrial policy, you cannot create your own net zero industry. You cannot create or strengthen your own chips industry, because the other powers are interfering on that, and they have an industrial policy. And you cannot be the only lasting piece of this world with a market without industrial policy. The US has one and strengthened it. China has one. We need a European one. It doesn't mean to become autarcic in this world, but it's how to have more autonomy, or to better diversify your dependencies, to be sure that you are not trapped in a crazy situation the day something wrong will happen. So having industrial policies is and will be critical in several fields. And I want to just insist on this one. One, energy. During the past year, we made a wonderful collective job. We diversified our gas furniture. We were over-dependent on Russia. We diversified through our market interventions, finding new producers from gas. But what we will have to do is to build a new strategy where we will have progressively to reduce our dependencies and build more sovereignty on energy. Which means that you can reconcile climate, and I totally agree, sovereignty and industry, by creating your own energy through basically less consumption and more energy efficiency and innovation, European innovation, but more renewables on the European soil and more nuclear energy on the European soil. This is clearly an industrial policy we are putting in place, and we have to put in place, because you have to put subsidies at the federal and national level to increase and accelerate these policies, and you have to find the right incentives to do so. Otherwise, everybody will be driven by short-term incentives and not take into consideration something else than price. You want them to take into consideration your independence, sovereignty, and climate change. This is an industrial policy where you have to gather industry, climate, and sovereignty. Second, all the energies, the technologies, and so on, you need in order to deal with climate change. We will fix climate change with a lot of regulations, and I know that your country knows very well what can happen when you put people and you progressively ask them to make a change through regulation when you have to do so. This is our agenda. This is what we decided for ourselves at the European scale. But we can do it as well if we produce the solutions on our soil. And this is critical if we want to reconcile climate change, industry, and creating economic value on our soil, and financing our social model, because there is no justice if there is no more production. If you don't produce money, you have no debate on how to share this money. And this is a big risk. If we rush for climate change, if we promote solutions we will buy, and if we don't produce these solutions. And this is exactly what's at stake today in the current environment. This is why we need industrial policy in Europe for net zero industry. And this is exactly the document issued by the European Commission a few days ago to promote this Net Zero Industrial Act, which is very important. This is how to accept some subsidies, some stated a current regulatory framework, but to be sure that we will produce and attract a maximum of innovations and new industries helping us to deal with carbon neutrality. This is critical. Otherwise, we will lose our sovereignty and our ability to decide. We will fit with the requirements. We will be carbon neutral for 2050. But with Chinese or American technologies, which will put us at risk and create a huge turmoil because it will kill jobs, and it will create a situation where we will not be in a situation to decide for ourselves. It's obviously the same on defense, where we need a common industry. And we have to streamline our organization, and we need this approach. And from the CHIPS Act, boosting R&D and producing much more on this critical field, to the Net Zero Industry Act, and so on, this second pillar of precisely an industrial policy in our Europe is absolutely key. As I don't want to be too long, I would say that it's exactly the same. We have to bear in mind for all the pillars where we don't want to be too much dependent. We want to be open, we want allies, we want good friends, we want partners, but we always want to be in a situation to choose them, not to be 100% dependent on them. And this is exactly the same on agriculture. We have to make a lot of changes to make our agriculture and food model compatible with climate change. But if the result of our policy is to import more and more products coming from countries less restrictive than we are or less demanding than we are, this is a failure at the end. So we do need an industrial policy for our agriculture, precisely to produce here with our rules, but to help our producers to do more. And this is why we did advocate at the European scale a protein plan to be less dependent on protein and to produce more on our continent. The third pillar of this strategy, according to me, is protection. Protection of our interests. This is, I would say, the defensive side of this offensive strategy I mentioned with industrial policy. Indeed, we have to accept to protect vital interests and strategic assets when we consider they could be put at risk, when you have hostile action or distortive actions or practices. And I think this is very important. Based on security and public order criteria, the EU has, for the first time, equipped itself with a tool allowing to block or ban holdings or foreign acquisitions in strategic companies. What we decided through this regulation is a complete ideological change. Till very recently, we just considered we were open without any conditions. We recognize, for good reasons, that we need a screening of these foreign investments on some critical assets. We did exactly the opposite, by the way. During and after the financial crisis, when we pushed some member states to fire sales, selling critical assets, for instance, to Chinese interests. I mean, energy companies, ports, and so on. We decided to do now something very different. So on cyber infrastructure, critical infrastructure, cyber security, everywhere we consider we have vulnerabilities or national and European security at risk, we are entitled to have this protection mechanism to be activated and precisely to have this preventive side. This is the same on a lot of other issues, from defense to technologies and so on, and I think it's very important. And according to me, this is exactly how and why we have to follow up on the digital side regarding content, speaking about education and culture. We were driven by free speech. I do defend and I do advocate this notion, and I'm a big defender of this free speech approach and freedom of content because it's part of the European model. But let's be clear, when you're open without any regulation to protect yourself in this content, you expose yourself to propaganda coming from outside. You expose yourself to algorithms decided elsewhere. And you put your children, your people, sometimes your democracy at risk. Because it can be manipulated by other interests and by people deciding for yourselves. And this is why we have now a new continent on this protective side, which is how we want to protect the content of our social medias, our artificial intelligence, on all these innovations where, we are exposed to, and which can interfere in the education of our children or the functioning of our democracy. We have to be very smart, sophisticated, coordinated, and we need a common approach. We started to do so with the famous directive DSA. We started to regulate the content. But we will have to go further, we know that, just to protect our model and our European model, and not to be in the hands of non-European private interests or non-European government interests. And I think this prevention pillar and this protection pillar is very important. The fourth pillar of our doctrine, according to me, would be reciprocity. And it would constitute, in the context of a more transactional and mutually beneficial approach, a very important circle of action of the EU. I know that the reciprocity dimension, which is certainly the most demanding at EU level, is sometimes difficult to admit. But I also observe that mindsets have gradually evolved in this area as well. It took almost 10 years for the EU to adopt the international procurement instrument, just to ensure reciprocity in public procurement. Why? Because the European approach is always a sort of complex intrication of addition of national interests. And sometimes the offensive points of some countries doesn't meet with the defensive points of the other countries. And the result is that we wanted the market to do the job. We need reciprocity. And I want to insist on the fact that reciprocity will be core, especially for the new generation of trade agreement. We will have all this debate, we know that, on Mercosur and some other trade agreements. This is very well known, and it will be everywhere, in your press, in my press, in our parliaments. I do believe in openness. I think that trade was very beneficial for the Europeans and very beneficial for most of the places of this world, and one of the best ways to fight against poverty. But you need a fair trade, and reciprocity is part of it. And the free trade agreement must now to obey a rationale which goes beyond a purely economic logic. And I want to insist on at least 3 points. First, sustainability. It's simply impossible to conceive that our EU trade policy might not be fully sustainable. We should stop signing and accepting trade agreements with governments and people which don't respect Paris Agreement and our biodiversity commitments. Otherwise, we put ourselves to over-constraint, or at least constrain our producers following our requirements and our commitments, but we will accept to import products coming from places less demanding and not compliant with Paris Agreement and biodiversity agreements. This is a double whammy approach, because you will help them basically not to respect what you believe in. You will kill your industry and you import on top of that. So let's stop that. And at this regard, the EU-New Zealand agreement established a sort of gold standard in this area and should definitely be present in all future trade agreements, which means that you need as an essential clause, not as, I would say, just a confetti or something nice on the cake, not a cherry on the cake. An essential clause of your trade agreement should be the respect of climate change and biodiversity commitments. Second, it's fairness and a balance in concessions to avoid any detrimental effects of the on the EU economy, especially regarding the most sensitive sectors. And third, to clear strategic interest of the agreement for the EU. How would the agreement provide privileged access to critical raw material, for example? How would it contribute effectively to diversifying EU supplies in key sectors and so on? But besides that, what we need definitely is a mirror mechanism and mirror measures to be sure that when you put constraints on your producers, you ask the same to the producers coming from the country you are signing with. This is the only way to make this trade agreement sustainable and acceptable for your people and your industry. My last pillar and my last point about this doctrine is regarding cooperation. We have to promote our agenda through a series of cooperation in order to strengthen and extend our multilateral rules and instruments, and precisely to do more together and push this European model internationally. First of this cooperation, we have to be the one to revitalize and extend the multilateral framework. WTO is no more functioning. We need it. So we have to promote and re-promote this agenda with the US and some others. But an agreement was found on the fight against illegal fishing in June 2022. The new head of, the new chairman of WTO is making a wonderful job. We have to help her to resume the very important agenda we had, precisely in order to fix conflicts and to have clear mechanism in case of conflict. This is one of the best ways to be an open world more sustainable. Second, we have to ensure compliance by third countries with high standard of values. To this end, we have a very powerful tool, our single market as mentioned, but the external part of the single market. And the transformation of the EU has been very swift in this area too. It now makes use all of its policies well beyond the single channel of trade policy. We have started working in this direction. The instruments, for instance, to fight deforestation will, for instance, help tackle imported raw materials and processed products of which the production contributes directly or indirectly to deforestation, i.e., if we create a sort of condition of access to our single market sometimes, the fact that you cooperate on an agenda you find as essential, you are much more efficient. With regard to respect of fundamental rights, we know how much important this is, and this is exactly what we are promoting on due diligence, forced labor, and so on, and this is very important. I think this cooperative approach should be the one we use as well, working all together to team up all the European Union, its member states, the development agencies, European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Developments, playing together and promoting precisely our agenda, our interests and our values with third countries. But this cooperation is absolutely key with third countries if we want to be more efficient. This is exactly the same approach we want to promote for our development model in the June summit we will organize, having all the Europeans working together to set up a new standard. As you can see, with these 5 pillars, competitiveness and single market, industrial policy, protection, reciprocity, and cooperation, we can set up a new economic doctrine which will allow us to reconcile creating jobs, financing our social model, dealing with climate change, and being more sovereign and deciding for ourselves. And I think this is critical. This is critical in this period of time where we have war and economy is being weaponized. And everything in our economy will be progressively part of national security. And I think this is critical if we want to preserve our open model, to remain open and based our approach on this capital market model. But if we don't want to depend on the other ones, and if we want to preserve our values and our European model, which is based on humanism, and attachment to freedom and solidarity. Here at Nexus, 20 years ago, George Steiner gave an important speech about the idea of Europe. And he said, Europe is made up of cafes. This extends from Pesha's favorite cafe in Lisbon to the Odessa cafes haunted by Isaac Babel's gangsters. And I fully believe, I very often mention this moment of Steiner, and I fully believe in the spirit of cafe. As Steiner said, which thrives in our great continent, from Lisbon to Odessa, because cafes are closed where people are bombed. And cafe was a place where you can have controversies, discussions, you can share disagreements, but at the very end, you dream. Our Europe is made of dreams. But actual dreamers are very pragmatic. Otherwise, they finish with the dreams of the others. I'm a dreamer and idealistic, but I don't want my dreams to be dreamt in other people's language. I want our music to be the one to be played everywhere, dear Jordi. I want our literature to be precisely this permanent discussion between the different capitals of our continent, with one of the characteristics is precisely to have so many languages and to be in a certain way driven by this permanent translation. I want our model of complexity, unity through respect and diversity to be the one to be preserved. This is why we have to reset this economic doctrine. This is why European sovereignty is not just a concept or a fantasy, but it's absolutely, in a dangerous world, a necessity to live, dream for ourselves as Europeans. Thank you.
You're watching DW News. We've just been hearing from the French President, Emmanuel Macron, who's been giving a keynote speech in The Hague in the Netherlands. He's on a two-day visit to the Netherlands, a state visit, the first time in over 20 years that a French president has done so. And he gave quite an extensive speech there, broken down into 5 pillars. He touched on many issues, including climate change, the future of the economy in the European Union. But I think what we should do really is go to our correspondent in Brussels, Jack Parrock, who was also listening in to that speech, which is taking place in The Hague in the Netherlands. Jack, tell us, as I just mentioned, there was plenty of ground covered there, but what stood out for you the most?
I think the ending was super interesting for me. It was clear that Macron was really sort of feeling himself with his dream speech there, his sort of dream for Europe and making sure that we protect sovereignty in the European Union through the economic model. I mean, broadly, the stuff he was talking about making the capital market union, so keeping cash flowing harmoniously across the European Union, a lot of the ideas of the industrial model. These are things that he has repeatedly sort of stood on as a politician throughout his career. But I think it is significant that a politician of his stature, being the French president, sort of openly speaks about these ideas of greater European Union integration, whereas a lot of the leaders across the EU are always a little bit less favourable, a little bit more resistant or reluctant to give credit to the European Union for what he's doing. What he didn't mention, and what we were all hoping for him to mention, and perhaps he will do in the Q&A after this speech, is about the issue of Taiwan, the furore that he created when he said that Europe shouldn't follow America on its policy towards the Taiwanese state, which is, China hasn't ruled out retaking by force. And a lot of Americans are senior American politicians are coming out broadly in support of the Taiwanese at the moment.
Yeah, tell us actually, just before we move on to the speech again, just break it down for us, if you could, quite briefly, about that furore that's been taking place, and as well the reaction here in Europe to it.
Yeah, he briefed some journalists on his trip back from China, saying that essentially Europe should create its own philosophy, should be the third superpower in the world, and shouldn't just follow in America's footsteps or follow them in what they're doing. A lot of Republican senators in the US have been very unhappy about that. There have been some European politicians who've said that Macron simply doesn't speak for Europe on this issue. But the question is, how willing are other European politicians to either back him or really condemn him? And we'll see what he says perhaps in his wrap-ups in the Q&A now.
That's right. Well, we'll be keeping a close ear to that. But let's go back to the speech which we just heard there in The Hague. You've touched on it there. I was mentioning as well these 5 pillars of a new European doctrine: competitiveness and better European integration and industrial policy, among others. Overall, what was your feeling from his message? And as you mentioned there, for me as well, what really stood out was what he said there, "I'm a dreamer," which you also mentioned just a little bit before.
Yeah, I mean, those 5 pillars are things, as I say, that he's sort of stood on for a long time. He's desperate for Europe to be more integrated, specifically on the financial markets, specifically in banking. He sees that as a European power. He stood on that in both of his election campaigns to be elected as the French president. What's interesting as well is these policies that he's promoting, and he even mentioned it himself as part of that speech, are being sort of driven or sort of his political ideology is being supported by the pandemic, where Europe went out and bought vaccines together and supported each other economically, went out and decided that the recovery money would be collectively done in the European Commission, that they would get that money using the European Commission's AAA rating on international markets. And then the war in Ukraine, which has driven further European integration and even the idea of sort of further defence integration, as we've seen with the changes where ammunition is being bought collectively by some of the European Union member states, if not all of them, where it is a sticky issue for some of them. So those policies have been supported.
Right.
And as you said, he ended with this kind of dream session thing. He wants to make sure that European dreams are being done and that's a sort of sovereign decision and not done by other global partners.
Now, on the question of economic sovereignty, Jack, he said that Europe was driven by a customer approach and not by the citizen approach. Tell us a little bit more about what he meant by that.
Yeah, well, this is it. As Europe tries to sort of green its economies, what he's concerned about and what he laid out. But this is also, as well, a feeling across most of the European Union. This is part of the European Commission's strategic plan for what they're trying to do. When we saw European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on that trip with Macron to Beijing last week, that she was saying sort of similar things, is the idea that as we try and green our economies, instead of buying green technologies from partners like China, from America, from other partners around the world, instead Europe needs to create its own economy so that we're not customers to other partners around the world, but instead we're making the money. He spoke about the need to make money, which is something that he isn't often spoken about necessarily by a lot of politicians, but this idea that the economics need to be created within Europe for Europe. This is, again, a policy that he's stood on for a long time now, but he very, very clearly laid it out. I think it's really interesting what Macron's doing. As a second-term president, knowing that he doesn't need to be re-elected, he's making some broad stroke statements regularly, making these big trips to China, putting himself right in the centre of every single one of these debates, which also opens him up to criticism, as we've seen over the last few days with these comments related to Europe, being the follower of America.
Jack, we could talk about this all afternoon and evening. We didn't even mention the fact that there was a protest at the beginning of Macron's speech there in The Hague, but I'm sure we'll be covering that in later programmes. Jack Parrick, DW correspondent in Brussels. Thanks for that. Right, turning now to other news. Rescuers are trying to help 1,200 people adrift on 2 boats in the Mediterranean Sea between Italy and Greece. The Italian Coast Guard is coordinating the rescue. The migrants are stranded on overcrowded fishing boats. Authorities say there's been a sharp increase in crossings, with thousands of people arriving on the Italian island.